In this video, we'll discuss cybersecurity supply chain risk management, government guidelines and regulations for mitigating cyber supply chain risks. This video is brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College. The creation of this video was funded by a National Science Foundation Advanced Technological Education grant. My name is Lindamood-Craiger. I'm an Associate Professor of Cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. So this is the third and final video in a series of videos on cyber supply chain risk management. There were two videos previously produced. In the first videos, we defined the term supply chain, we defined the supply chain problem, we described the phases or stages of the supply chain, and we provided detailed examples of supply chain attacks and risks. In the final video, we'll be discussing solutions to the cyber supply chain problem. And it all stems from government regulations and guidelines regarding the acquisition of products. And many of these products are ICT related, that is information communication technologies. They're the computer hardware, hardware components, and software. And so the first we're going to talk about are the existing and emergent government regulations and guidelines. So as with all my videos, this is going to be an overview, and therefore I'm only going to be discussing some of the more important government regulations and guidelines. I'm going to start with the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, also called DFARS. And specifically, we're talking about DFARS Clause 252.204-7012, Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting. Then we'll discuss the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-171, Protected Controlled, Unclassified Information in Non-Federal Information Systems and Organizations. Then we'll discuss NIST's Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure, version 1.1. And we'll end by talking about emergent regulations and guidelines. And this is called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, also known as CMMC. So in case you haven't already watched the first two videos, let's go over a quick definition of supply chain. So a supply chain is a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product to the final buyer. This network includes different activities, people, entities, information, and resources. The supply chain also represents the steps it takes to get to the product or service from its original state to the customer. So we think about everything that we buy at a store has a supply chain associated with it, and there's multiple entities and multiple stages involved with that. Whether you're buying an iPhone or a bag of apples, there's a supply chain associated with it. And very quickly, this was covered more in depth in the second video and a little bit in the first video, but this is just a graphic depiction of what a supply chain looks like. If you look up in the upper left-hand corner, we have the program office, which is the buyer, and below that, to the right, we have something called a prime contractor, which is really the seller. And that's the seller of the final product. So the prime contractor is the seller that sells that product, whatever it is, to the program office, which is the buyer. So where do those products come from? And more specifically, where do those components come from? Because computers can be comprised of thousands or hundreds of thousands of hardware components and also millions of lines of software code. So the program office and prime contractor serve as the basis for the supply chain. And so the prime contractor can acquire those physical components from a supplier as well as the software code, or they can buy something that's already been built, commercial off the shelf. Or they can develop that in-house. They can have their software developers and their engineers develop the hardware and software. Or they could reuse something that they've already developed, or they can outsource this to another company, which is often quite frequently done. We're talking about perhaps thousands of physical components and thousands or hundred thousands or millions of lines of source code. They're going to get that from a supplier as well. A supplier is going to be the outsource for those physical components or software. Well, they can be either a U.S. supplier or somewhere that's global or foreign. And even then, if you consider, is that even those physical components could come from other contractors. And at each step of the supply chain, there's 7 different stages or phases, starting with the requirements, moving on to the actual design. You develop software or you manufacture the hardware, then you test the software and hardware. You distribute that to end user customers, and then those customers use it and they maintain it. And finally, at the end of its life cycle, the hardware and software is disposed of. So the cybersecurity supply chain problem is involved with who made the thousands of physical components that comprise the hardware? Who wrote the software code? Moreover, how well did they test the hardware and the software? So the problem is, if you don't know the exact source of hardware, physical components, and software, how do you know that your product is secure? And that in itself is a supply chain problem. So how can we mitigate the potential for cyber threats and risks to the supply chain? And just a point of note that these videos are supposed to be a high-level overview of the topics being discussed. So an entire course could be made of cyber supply chain risk management, or maybe even a series of courses. So the rules and regulations that I'm going to be discussing are some very important and high-level ones. So the first regulation we'll be discussing, and really the driver for all the other regulations, is something called DFARS 252.204-7012, Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting. And DFARS stands for Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. And this regulation contains requirements of law for federal contractors wishing to do business with the government. That is, a federal contractor that wants to bid on a federal contract. And this covers any federal contract and all federal contractors, including the big ones like Boeing and Lockheed, Northrop, and Cubic. And businesses must meet these requirements, that is, they must be in compliance with them in order to bid on these federal contracts, some of which range from tens of millions all the way to billions of dollars. And so this clause deals specifically with the security of unclassified defense information and cybersecurity incident reporting. And this is one of the subclauses, dealing with adequate security of unclassified information. So the contractor shall provide adequate security on all covered contractor information systems. And notice that it doesn't specify exactly what adequate security is. But later on, we'll see that that's specified in other government documents. But what this does is it provides a high-level overview of what needs to be done for a federal contractor to bid on a government contract. And this is an example of those more specific areas of compliance. The contractor shall implement NIST Special Publication 800-171 as soon as practical, but not later than December 31st, 2017. So essentially what DFARS does is it sets out the high-level requirements for government contracting and then points to other more specific documents in terms of more detailed information on the policies and procedures that need to be implemented in the contractor's organization. DFARS also deals with cyber incident reporting, and that essentially says that if a contractor discovers a cyber incident that is covered, then that needs to be reported. And if we go back and look at this graphic that deals with the supply chain, when there's a contract between the prime contractor, the seller, and the program office, the buyer, is that any and all sources that are involved in this need to be compliant with DFARS. But the one that's going to attest, that is the organization that's going to attest that they are in compliance, is just going to be this prime contractor. And it's been that way for several decades. But as we see later on, is that that's no longer going to be applicable moving forward. And so it's the prime contractor that's going to self-verify the fact that all those DFARS clauses are being met, and therefore that prime contractor is in compliance. And therefore, they must be aware of all these other sources that are supplying components in hardware and the fact that they're actually being compliant with those DFARS regulations. So that should tell you our next topic is going to be NIST SP 800-171, Protecting Controlled Unclassified Information in Non-Federal Systems and Organizations. Notice that word non-federal systems and organizations. If we look back at this graphic, the program office is going to be the U.S. government. And then they're under contract with a non-federal system or organization. So everything else in here, the prime contractor and all the other sources, are going to be covered by this 800-171 and protecting unclassified information. So what was the purpose of NIST 800-171? Today, more than any time in history, the federal government is relying on external service providers to help carry out a wide range of federal missions and business functions using information systems. Many federal contractors process, store, and transmit sensitive federal information to support the delivery of essential products and services to federal agencies. For example, providing financial services, providing web and electronic mail services, processing security clearances or healthcare data, providing cloud services, and developing communications, satellite, and weapon systems. The federal information is frequently provided to or shared with entities such as state and local governments, college and universities, and independent research organizations. So to mitigate the risks of the loss of controlled unclassified information, NIST published 800-171, dealing with the protection of controlled unclassified information. Control meaning that the government limits who has access to this information. However, at the same time, it's not classified information, it's unclassified information. And the information is going to be resident on non-federal systems and organizations. That is, some organization or entity outside of the federal government or the Department of Defense. And so NIST 800-171 provides agencies with recommended security requirements for protecting the confidentiality of the CUI when the information is resident on these non-federal systems. And 800-171 contains what's called security families, and there are 14 of those, starting with access control, awareness and training, audit and accountability, all the way to security assessment, system and communications protection, system and information integrity. And within each of those families, there are guidelines for securing systems and information. And it looks something like this. So if you look at 3.1 of 800-171, you'll see something about access controls. And 3.1.1 says limit system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users, and devices including other systems. And if we look at the third column, this indicates this requirement's association with NIST Special Publication 800-53, which is Security and Privacy Controls for Federal Information Systems and Organizations. On the far right-hand side, you see the ISO IEC 27001, which is an international standard for information security management. And note that the actual requirements that are recommended in this document are derived from that NIST Special Publication 800-53. And the next important set of guidelines was the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity version 1.1. Now this is normally called the framework. And the framework is a prioritized, flexible, repeatable, performance-based, and cost-effective approach, including information security measures and controls that may be voluntarily adopted by owners and operators of critical infrastructure to help them identify, assess, and manage cyber risks. Now we ask ourselves, what does cyber supply chain have to do with critical infrastructure? Well, the framework goes on to say that it focuses on using business drivers to guide cybersecurity activities and considering cybersecurity risks as part of the organization's risk management processes. Notice the word risk management. And finally, the framework can be used by organizations in any sector or community, as it enables organizations, regardless of size, degree of cybersecurity risk, or cybersecurity sophistication, to apply the principles and best practices of risk management to improving security and resilience. And so while the framework was initially targeting critical infrastructure, what they're saying here is it can be applied to any organization as a way of managing risk. And that includes cyber supply chain risks. And the framework is broken down by function, categories, subcategories, and informative references. But let's just talk about the framework functions, as this is a very general overview. So functions organize basic cybersecurity activities at their highest level. And this matrix shows the function and category unique identifiers. And notice that they're broken down by function, including to identify the problem, to protect, to detect the problem, to respond to the problem, and then to recover from the problem. On the right-hand side, you see the category of the identifier, ranging from asset management and business environment for identify, all the way through recovery planning, improvements, and communications for recovery. Notice that under the identify function, there is a specific category for supply chain risk management. The framework then goes into a more complete and detailed analysis of each of those unique identifiers. Here's the unique identifier for supply chain risk management. Notice within those we have subcategories. So the first subcategory is ID.SC-1. Cyber supply chain risk management processes are identified, established, assessed, managed, and agreed to by organizational stakeholders. On the right-hand side, you have informative references, which are just references to external resources regarding that unique identifier. So you may be asking yourself, why do we need so many regulations and guidelines? Why doesn't 800-171 handle everything? Why doesn't the framework handle everything? And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is supply chains existed long before cyber became a problem. Second, after realizing that there's risks with these new products and new risks in the supply chain, that cybersecurity of the supply chain was essentially an add-on. Now I want you to think about building a house, and let's build a house back in the 1940s. Now when you built a house back then, to make it safe and secure, you built it to a certain specification. Now let's say that climate change has come along and there's more tornadoes or more hurricanes. So you say, okay, I'm going to strengthen my house. Well, that's a lot different than saying, I now live in a hurricane zone or tornado zone and I'm going to build from the ground up a house or a structure that can handle hurricanes and tornadoes. That's going to be a much stronger infrastructure, a much stronger structure than one where safety and security was added on after the fact. But there's another reason as well. When it comes to meeting the requirements for 800-171 in the framework, a contractor would be self-verifying. That is, they would say, yes, I am in compliance with all of these clauses and therefore I am DFARS compliant. So I want you to think about that as a student and you're taking a test and then your instructor asks you to grade your own test. Now I'm guessing that most of you would go in and you'd given the answers that you would grade your test and you'd be trustworthy and you could verify your grade. However, there's going to be some students, a small portion, that are probably going to fudge their answers and say that they got a 90 when actually it was an 82 or 72. And that's the issue with compliance, is that up until now, the verification of compliance was done by the contractor. And this is a joint statement before the Military Technology Transfer Threats, Impacts, and Solutions for the Department of Defense House Armed Services Committee, and it really speaks to the problem I just discussed. And the quote is, to elevate the private sector's focus on security, the department has established a Deliver Uncompromised initiative that's focused on industry delivery of capabilities, services, technologies, and weapon systems that are uncompromised by our malign actors from cradle to grave. It aims to establish security as a fourth pillar in acquisition, on par with cost, schedule, and performance, and to create incentives for industry to embrace security not as a cost center, but as a key differentiator. What does this mean? Essentially what I was saying before is normally if we look back 40 or 50 years when cyber really wasn't critical and barely existed, is that when a government contractor was bidding on a government contract, the most important parts of that contract were cost, schedule, and performance. After cyber came into play, it was just an add-on. It was considered as a cost center, as it's something that you have to pay for. What this is saying is that cybersecurity is just as important in the acquisition process as cost, schedule, and performance. But how do you do that if you have self-verification and contractors saying, yes, we meet all the requirements stipulated in 800-171 that are applicable to the DFARS? Well, the way you do that is through Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which just came out in January 30th of 2020. While compliance with the DFARS is mandatory, as is compliance with NIST Special Publication 800-171, in most cases, compliance with these regulations is based on the honor system, as I just said. The challenge with the honor system is that companies tend to be overly optimistic when asked about whether they are compliant. And this is where the CMMC comes in. So the CMMC was released on 30 January 2020, and it's a unified standard for implementing cybersecurity across the defense industrial base. And that includes over 300,000 companies in a defense industrial base supply chain. So previously, contractors were responsible for implementing, monitoring, and certifying the security of their information technology systems and any sensitive DoD information stored or transmitted by those systems. Now, under the CMMC, contractors are responsible for implementing cybersecurity requirements, but third-party assessments of contractors' compliance with certain mandatory practices is required. Essentially, what this means is no longer will federal contractors be able to self-verify that they are meeting these requirements. Instead, they're going to have to pay a third-party assessor to come in to verify that they are in compliance. So the CMMC is broken up into 5 different levels, ranging from 1 to 5. The second column lists the total number of practices that are introduced per level. So there's 17 at level 1, 55 at level 2, 58 at level 3, and so on. And then to the right of that, you see the source of those practices. And the first column under sources is CFR 52.204-21, which is the Federal Code of Regulations, Basic Safeguarding of Covered Contract Information Systems. And then the 2 columns to the right are 2 different versions of 800-171, and then the final column you have an other. So notice that the practices that are listed in the CMMC actually come from other sources. And then, as indicated before, is that there's 5 levels, and that's broken down according to process and practices. And you see that level 1 is performed, level 2 is documented, level 3 is managed, level 4 is reviewed, and finally level 5, which is the most secure level, is optimizing. In terms of practice progression, we have level 1, which is basic cyber hygiene. Level 2 is intermediate cyber hygiene. Level 3, good cyber hygiene. Level 4 is proactive, and level 5 is advanced or progressive, with 5 being, of course, the most secure. So this shows you how the CMMC is broken down by processes and practices with 5 levels. So at level 1, a company must perform basic cyber hygiene practices such as using antivirus software or ensuring employees change passwords regularly. At level 2, a company must document certain intermediate cyber hygiene practices to begin to protect any controlled, unclassified information through implementation of NIST Special Publication 800-171, Revision 2, Security Requirements. At level 3, a company must have an institutionalized management plan to implement a good cyber hygiene practice to safeguard controlled, unclassified information, including all of NIST's 800-171 Revision 2 security requirements. At level 4, a company must have implemented processes for reviewing and measuring the effectiveness of practices, as well as established additional enhanced practices to detect and respond to changing tactics, techniques, and procedures of advanced persistent threats. An advanced persistent threat is defined as an adversary that possesses sophisticated levels of expertise and significant resources that allow it to create opportunities to achieve its objectives by using multiple attack vectors. And finally, level 5, a company must have standardized and optimized processes in place across the organization and additional enhanced practices that provide more sophisticated capabilities to detect and respond to advanced persistent threats. Now, as it turns out, there are 17 practices at the first level. There are 55 additional practices at the second level, 58 additional practices at the third level, 26 at the fourth level, and finally 15 at the highest level of 5. Now, all DoD contractors will eventually be required to obtain a CMMC certification. This includes all suppliers at all tiers along the supply chain, small business, commercial item contractors, and foreign suppliers. The government has, for over the last 2 decades, attempted to strengthen the cyber supply chain through government regulations and guidelines. And this includes new clauses to the DFARs. It includes NIST special publications, including 800-171, 800-53. It also includes the new NIST Framework. And finally, the emergent guideline is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which now includes, in addition to meeting the requirements as stipulated in many other governmental regulations, including 800-171, it also includes third-party assessors to come in and verify the level at which the organization is operating. However, initial efforts have been less than perfect, and the reason is that cybersecurity has been looked at as an afterthought. The supply chain has been working for the government for many decades. And then when cyber has come into play, it was looked at as an afterthought because initially in purchasing and acquisition, the main factors are cost, schedule, and performance. And in the last few years, the government has realized that cybersecurity should be from the ground up in terms of the supply chain and not as an afterthought. And recent and emergent guidelines, including the CMMC, now require third-party assessments of entities' cybersecurity practices in order to bid on government contracts. This video has been brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College.